Our primary instruction for this assignment was to tell a good story. This is a story about stories. Who's telling them, who's hearing them, and how they change over time. 2 years ago, in December of 2013, I was at Walt Disney World, riding a ride called Splash Mountain, and feeling distinctly uncomfortable. After all, the news of race relations that fall had been things like Paula Dean's wedding with a plantation theme, or the news of Duck Dynasty star Phil Robertson's interview with GQ. Robertson said, "I never heard one of them, one black person say, 'I tell you what, these doggone white people, not a word.' Pre-entitlement, pre-welfare, you say, were they happy? They were godly, they were happy. No one was singing the blues." Here I was surrounded by audio animatronic animals that represented African American figures, and they were singing and happy. And yet this troubled me. Splash Mountain is based on Walt Disney's 1946 film Song of the South, a film that, at least in the United States, you may no longer see. The story itself is based on the stories of Brer Rabbit, the Uncle Remus legends. Those were collected by a white newspaper man named Joel Chandler Harris. What Disney added to that tale was a frame narrative. A young boy named Johnny goes to live with his grandmother, along with his mother, while his father goes back to Atlanta. The reasons are not entirely clear. This happens in the period after the Civil War. Johnny wants to go back to Atlanta to be reunited with his father, but Uncle Remus, a kindly old black man, becomes a surrogate father figure and tells him the stories of Brer Rabbit. Brer Rabbit in the African American tradition is, as Ralph Ellison talks about, and Stanley Hyman, a trickster figure. Brer Rabbit has his enemies, his predators, Brer Fox and Brer Bear. His enemies are more powerful, larger, imposing. Brer Rabbit is smaller, weaker, and has to rely on his wits, cunning, and trickery to survive. Song of the South takes three of those stories. The story of how Brer Rabbit got flung back into the briar patch, the story of the tar baby, and the story of the laughing place, and turns them into parables that Uncle Remus tells to little Johnny as a way of getting along in the life of the plantation, away from his father and from Atlanta. Walt Disney really needed Song of the South to be successful. The movie Fantasia, released in 1940, had been a flop. Disney also had economic problems coming from an animator strike. He only survived the period of the 40s because the U.S. government gave him work making films for the war effort. In 1946, now that the war was over, he desperately needed a hit, and he needed it to be cost-effective. Song of the South was intended to do that by taking this frame narrative of Johnny and Uncle Remus, shot in live action, more cheaper, and then fitting that around cartoon segments. At this point, however, the live action is dull, it's boring, it's awful. Also, at the time, many critics, both white and black, criticized the racial politics of Song of the South. The NAACP organized a boycott. The critic Bosley Crowther of the New York Times was very stern in his condemnation of the film. However, the planned protest soon petered out because the film was financially unsuccessful. Many folks thought at this point, why bother? However, Song of the South was re-released, first in 1956, again in 1972, 1980, and 1986. It wasn't very popular in 1956 either. It really only gained traction with the 1972 re-release. That re-release made more money than the previous two releases combined. It was even more popular in 1980 and did well in 1986 as well. So here's an interesting thing. The movie becomes more popular as time goes on and is protested less. This gives rise to the assumption that, well, all films during that period were like that. The film actually became more popular the longer it got from its initial release date. This speaks to the pull of nostalgia. Nostalgia works in this way. First of all, part of the reason that the movie became more popular was because of the proliferation of ancillary products. The cartoon segments had been cut out and then reshown on television. For instance, in the mid-50s, Disney had a television show on ABC called Disneyland. The very first episode featured one of the animated segments from Song of the South. Also, little golden books retelling stories of the Tar Baby, as well as children's records, made it more popular. The film itself is an exercise in nostalgia. Some critics have argued that in the period it was released in 1946, in a growing technological society, it harkened back to a period where there was less technology, a more pastoral, rural South. But one of the problems is that the setting is precisely indistinct. Many people have hard times deciding whether the film actually takes place after the Civil War or before. One reason for that would be the depiction of African Americans on the plantation. They are, as Robertson noted, singing and not at all unhappy. And then there's the plantation itself. It seems to have suffered no consequences of Reconstruction. At least one model of Song of the South was 1939's Gone with the Wind. The similarity is in the title. 1939 was also the year that Disney negotiated for the rights for the Joel Chandler Harris material. But even in Gone with the Wind, we see after the war, the plantations are ruined. This doesn't happen in Song of the South. Further, here's another question. For whose benefit are the Uncle Remus stories told? As I've tried to point out earlier, the stories are primarily stories of resistance. They're meant for African American. Also, these stories exist in Native American forms as well. Are ways of those who are less powerful resisting those who are more powerful. And yet, these stories change in Disney's telling. Their audience from African American or Native American into Caucasian. These are stories of resistance told by a black man for the richest little white boy on the plantation. In this way, Uncle Remus changes from a resistance figure into what some critics have called the magical Negro. The magical Negro is one who has no real agency, no real past, no real goals within the plot. He exists almost entirely to help the white protagonist achieve his or her goals. If these characters still exist in cinema. As a matter of fact, I would say practically every role that Morgan Freeman has ever played has been a variation on this magical Negro. And so, this really changes who gets this story told. I think this is exactly what Ellison is talking about when he talks about the mask and the role taken on by minstrels. This works with the film Song of the South and Splash Mountain as well, because what it does is seeks to reassure white consumers about their place within race relations. If we've got kindly African Americans helping us achieve our goals, then how could race relations be that bad? A big part of what bothered me that day about the storyline of Splash Mountain was this, that Brer Rabbit's primary objective is to learn that his lighting out for the territory, his going off in search of adventure was misguided. That in fact, where he really needed to be was at home. This is counter to the whole ethos of Disneyland and Disney World. Splash Mountain at Walt Disney World sits opposite of Tom Sawyer Island, a place where we celebrate Tom and Huck lighting out for the territory. It sits in Frontierland, where we laud the American restlessness that leads us out to the frontier. From the top of Splash Mountain, you can see into Adventureland. This, with its very name, says we should be seeking adventure, exactly the opposite of the message of Brer Rabbit within this ride. It made me wonder, is that seeking of adventure, that desire to light out for the territory, reserved for whites only in Disney World? I think that the legacy of Song of the South is complicated. There are no easy answers. Certainly, it comes out of a tradition of resistance. But that resistance has been domesticated. And basically, the line that's embroidered in cross stitch on in the line for the ride tells us that you can't outrun trouble. There's no place that far. Stay home, it seems to say, even to those slaves who were working on the plantation in Song of the South. Thank you.